Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Friday morning, and thank you to the BEGA team for inviting me to participate in Ethics Week. I perused the attendees. I think I'm familiar with a few of you, and I actually think a couple of you have attended some of the trainings and learning opportunities offered by the Office of Racial Equity. And I see the attendee count joining, so I may just give it a couple more seconds. And while we're waiting for folks to join, I'll pull up our slide deck for today. All right, hopefully everyone can see the slides, and when I'm in this mode, I can't see the chat. So I may come out of this mode once we do an exercise that requires you to use the chat box. But for those who don't know me, my name is Amber Hewit. I am the Chief Equity Officer for DC government and Director of the Mayor's Office of Racial Equity. And looking forward to joining you all today to talk about the intersections of equity and ethics. I know the theme for this week has been everyday ethics. You can't go a day without it. And I would argue that that we should also think about everyday equity and how can we center equity. And the charge of my office is centering racial equity specifically in our work when we're engaging with residents, when we are developing policies, programs, and practices that directly impact the lives of DC residents. And when we think about ethics, we think about an examination of what's right and what's just. And I would also say that when we think about applying an equity lens, that requires that same examination. And the last sort of intro connection point that I'll make before we get started is that when we think about racial equity is good government the same way that ethics is. So some of the content today mirrors the content that we provide for MSS staff across government in our foundational training called Advancing Racial Equity, the Role of Government. Some of the slides will be for reference. So BEGA should have the slides. So some of the slides I won't spend as much time on because I do want to at least engage with you through the chat box a couple times throughout our time today. So I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. In many of our presentations, and particularly our trainings, we start with the land acknowledgement. Recognizing that the Nacotchtank and Piscataway peoples were the first residents of the land that we now call the District of Columbia. So it's important that we acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth and acknowledging that we stand on the ancestral lands of the Anacostan and Nacotchtank peoples. And it's important that we pay respect to their elders, past and present. So a few learning objectives today. I know we only have an hour together, but I wanted to begin with what we will cover today. Some of you have participated in our training, so this may be a refresher, but how can we build a shared language of racial equity? How does that apply to our work and ourselves? And again, I want you to think about this content in connection with what it means to guide ethical and be a part of the ethical decision-making process. Our second learning objective is developing a shared lens and racial equity analysis. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about key terminology. We'll end with a way to contact the office and our website that has more resources. So we won't do a deep dive in everything related to racial equity, but we'll also end with a racial equity tool. So what are the skills that we can utilize as we're analyzing policies and practices from a racial equity and ethical lenses. We're going to talk about a racial equity impact assessment that our team developed. And then hopefully you leave with ways to further put this work into practice. So I love to start with this quote because when we're talking about racial equity and justice, we're also talking about redressing past harms and how we acknowledge the land that we are on. It's also important that we acknowledge the role that government throughout all the levels of government, federal, local, state, historically have perpetuated racial injustice. So I see that as a great opportunity for us in district government to redress those past harms. And our only chance at dismantling racial injustice is being more curious about its origins than we are worried about our own comfort. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with the Office of Racial Equity, Mayor Bowser appointed me as the district's first Chief Equity Officer about 2.5 years ago now, in April 2021, so a little over 2 years ago. And our office is charged with developing the framework to guide agencies in the development of just policies and practices. We're going to talk about briefly the infrastructure that we have set up that is built upon the existing infrastructure. It is an extension of Mayor Bowser's vision of creating a more racially equitable DC. Another key piece to know about our office is that we also carry forward a law that was passed by DC Council in December of 2020, the Racial Equity Achieves Results Act. So many of the initiatives and programs that we have created directly align with some of the provisions in that law. So again, I know some of you are familiar with that definition, but it's important to think about racial equity as both a process and an outcome. And I think you can think about ethics in that way as well, that in order for a decision to be made, there are processes that are in place that when it comes to racial equity, we're driving towards changing outcomes where race will no longer predict the opportunities, outcomes, or the distribution of resources. But that requires a process, and that process calls for meaningfully engaging district residents, other stakeholders, those who are most directly impacted by the policies and practices that shape their everyday lives. So how do we put this work into practice? So this is our theory of change that we share with other jurisdictions who are carrying forward racial equity work. And it's also borrowed from a national network of jurisdictions that some of you may be familiar with called the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, or GARE. And it starts with developing a standardized language. So, racial equity, unfortunately, in some ways has become a buzzword. We're now sort of 3 years past the murder of George Floyd, and we're seeing states sort of rolling back racial equity initiatives. So I think we're fortunate in DC government under Mayor Bowser's leadership to continue centering racial equity in our work. But similar to the definition that we just outlined, how do we develop a shared vocabulary around what is racial equity? Next is, how do we build the capacity to do this work? So you all are ethics officers. I think we have general counsel on, key players in the ethical decision-making processes across district government. And I think this week you all are have engaged in sessions to help build your capacity to do that work. So similarly, how do we build the capacity to center racial equity and apply a racial equity lens? And we do that by conversations and sessions like this. The third part of our theory of change is putting it into practice. What are explicit tools that we can apply across government operations? I sit within the Office of the City Administrator, so we are getting to be very close to the launch of budget season. And one of the tools that we have developed in partnership with the Office of Budget and Performance Management is a racial equity budget tool. So if many of you may be a part of that, part of your agency's budget formulation process, we won't go over that tool today, but we will go over our more broader racial equity tool. And then lastly, how are we going to measure and track our progress? And that sometimes is a critique of DEI. So it can't just be consciousness raising or reflecting on our biases. We have to also look at what are the systemic and structural barriers that could be perpetuating inequities, and how are we changing outcomes and promoting more equitable outcomes. So our team is working right now with Octo to develop a racial equity dashboard to sort of show where we are, and also with the goal of sort of driving policy and practice change to close and eventually eliminate equity gaps. So I want to engage in this exercise, and some of you may be familiar with this, but I want to have you all sort of think about in a different way what we mean by racial equity and the impact of structural racism. And this is an exercise we call the allegory of the fish in the lake. And we borrowed this from the Racial Equity Institute out of North Carolina. And it calls you to think about this image on the left. So imagine that you're walking around your neighborhood and you come across the image on the left. You're passing by a lake and you see one fish dead by this lake. So I want at least a few people to put in the chat, and if you've done this before, maybe you can hold back. What question or questions would you ask yourself? So you're on a walk, you pass by this lake, and you see one fish dead in the lake. If you could just put in the chat, what question or questions would you ask yourself? Is it just one fish? Are there more fish? What's in the water? Hi, April. I know you're familiar with this exercise. How did it get there? Why did it die? Ooh, they're coming in fast. Was it sick? What happened? What happened? Okay. So I saw most of the comments around sort of how did it get there? Could there be others? Are there dead animals? What's wrong with the fish? Okay. Thank you for that. So now we're going to imagine it's the second day and you're passing by that same body of water, excuse me, and you see the image on the right. So countless number of fish dead in the same body of water. First day, one fish. Second day, multiple fish, countless number of fish dead in the water. If you could put in the chat, what question or questions would you ask yourself? Okay, what's wrong with the water? Wrong with the lake? Wrong with the water? What's wrong with the water? I think I saw a similar theme. Who's responsible? Kimberly says, in a state of panic. Is there something wrong with the water? Is the water safe for me to drink? What do I do to prevent this? Was this intentional? I think that question reminds me of the Flint water crisis. Okay. So, Eric, what happened and how do we fix it? Great. So these are great questions. April coming in again, water contaminated, other reasons that it occurs. What actions can we take? So thank you for that. And we use this example to really highlight in what I noticed that most of the questions when we were imagining ourselves walking around the lake and just seeing one dead fish, most of the questions around, what's wrong with the fish? Was it sick? How did it get there? I did see a couple questions about the water, but there were more questions when you were imagining yourself walking around, thank you, Camille, walking around the lake the second day and seeing countless number of fish dead in the lake. I noticed a greater sense of urgency and panic. I saw some exclamation points being used. There were, I think Eric and maybe others talked about what can I do to fix it? There was even a more desire to actually fix the problem. So we use that this example to highlight in the US, we tend to be a nation of fish fixers versus lake fixers. So the fish is sick, or this person is sick, or this person has a challenge or an issue, or this person is experiencing, or a group of people are experiencing inequities. What can we do to fix this fish? Or what programs and services can we provide to this fish? Versus looking at the lake that is creating, or in some ways, at least perpetuating some of the inequities that are causing the fish to die. To take this further, we think about what connects all our bodies, of water, and thinking about the groundwater that's connected to all of our bodies of water. And we use the groundwater as a metaphor for structural racism, that we can't just look at, the BEGA lake. We have to look at the OUC lake, the Department of Health lake, the Department of Education lake. All of these lakes and systems are interconnected and reinforcing one another. So when we think about racial equity, we have to think about how all of these systems are working together, and that we can't just focus on one system. We have to weigh the benefits and burdens of all of our decisions and how they impact the system as a whole. So we use the groundwater as a metaphor for structural racism. And I know that as ethical decision makers in government, that you all weigh those same, things as well, that you can't just think about this one particular person and one decision. Like how do all of these factors that you're weighing influence and impact one another? So we use this example to really show the impact of structural racism, and that we have to look at what's going on within our policies and practices at the structural level that are creating worse outcomes for people most impacted by structural racism. And from this example, there are three facts based on data. And typically in our training sessions, we go more in depth, but for today, we're just going to highlight briefly what those facts are based on data. And the first is that racial inequity exists within every system and manifests similarly across systems. So it isn't just one lake that we see inequities or disparities. We see them in health, education, criminal justice, the carceral legal system. We see them in all of the different systems. The second is that, going back to that fish versus lake, or that person versus structure, sometimes it's easy to explain away inequities by looking at socioeconomic differences. Oh, maybe it's about class and it's not really about race. But if we look at the data, socioeconomic differences do not explain racial inequity. And I can talk more about that if there are questions later. And the third is that systems contribute significantly to disparities. And I present this, when you look at this, it can be overwhelming to think about the work that we have to do to promote equitable outcomes. But as part of the system, part of government, I really see it as a great opportunity to use the tools that we have to further equity and justice. So to think about some of the key terminologies, just so we're just level setting a little bit here, just wanted to talk about some of the distinctions between equity versus equality. I think some of you may be familiar with the image of little ones looking into a baseball field, and they're all different heights and they all need sort of different levels of support to see inside the baseball game. But I really like this image because they're plants all on the same field, well, all on the same level of ground, but they're different plants. They need different things. They need different amounts of sun and water to thrive. And that's what we mean when we talk about the differences between equality and equity, is that equity asks, what does each individual need to thrive? What do they already have? So it's also strengths-based and asset-based. And equality doesn't always consider what individuals may already have, what they need, or what they may want. So we think about equitable decision making. We're thinking, we're also bringing into that decision making process. What are the strengths of this individual or community? How can we leverage that? But then also, what are some of the what's part of the historical context that's shaping the outcomes that we see? So I want to transition. Again, we're still talking about key terminology and thinking about the intersections of equity and DEI. There's so many acronyms now. Here we have DEIJ. You may have heard of DEIB. The B stands for belonging. Sometimes the letters are switched around. But I present this to acknowledge that, but then also highlight some of the distinctions between sort of traditional DEI over the past, 4 or 5 decades, that has been, a focus on primarily sort of human resources, like how do we increase diversity in our organizations. And DEI tends to be internally focused and often regulated to matters of human resources. And DEI sometimes often keeps the focus on individual and institutional levels of injustice or racism. But when we talk about equity and then justice really requires us to look at those structures, sort of what's going on in the lake. And also acknowledging that we can't live in, we can't just look within our silos. It's easy to do that in government, but how these structures are reinforcing each other, and how can we challenge the system itself to promote work environments, promote our city in a way where everyone can thrive and live to their potential. So we often get this question, my team often gets this question, like, why are we leading with race? So again, I'm the director of the Office of Racial Equity, and obviously we have to look at our intersecting identities as well. But we do lead with race, one, looking at the historical context and how race has been used, and the significance of race in the development of our city and our nation. It's also our charge from the mayor and the charge from the REACH Act, the law that we talked about earlier that our office carries forward. And it's also, like I said, good government, that applying a racial equity lens to our decision making will help us be more effective and efficient in our work as individuals and as agencies. So that is why we lead with race, but we often say we lead with race, but we don't end with race, that we're race explicit, but we're not race exclusive, and that we have to also take an intersectional lens as well, that we all have multiple social identities. And it is important to look at the intersection of race and gender, or race and class, race and sexual orientation. So I do want to highlight that as one of our guiding principles. So we're going to shift a little bit. So before we go over sort of how we fix this, I'm remembering one of the questions when we were thinking about the image of those countless number of fish dead in the lake. So we're still talking about key terminology. We're going to shift in a second to go over our racial equity tool, and then hopefully have time to think about how you can integrate this into the work within your agencies. So when we think about ethics, I think it's really important that we also think about bias. So that's one of the key terms that I wanted to talk about today, which is defined as an inclination or preference, an inclination of preference, especially one that interferes with impartial judgment. And I'm a psychologist by training, so it's important to acknowledge that us as humans, that there's no way that we can really fully process all the external stimuli that our brain is tracking, that our mind takes shortcuts. We have these things called cognitive schemas, but they're things that we can do to interrupt and stop bias. So there are different types of bias. So I wanted to talk about that briefly. I know this is something that you all think about as decision makers and thinking about ethics, that we know that bias can show up at the individual level, which tends to be a little easier to spot versus the institutional level. So at the individual level, and if it's explicit, we can see when bias is manifesting. You know, if you hear someone call someone a racial and ethnic slur, or stereotyping someone. So that would be very explicit at the individual level. At the implicit level is where our sort of unchecked, unconscious attitudes and beliefs may come to bear. So the example that we have on the far right is a case manager wrongfully assuming a client is ineligible for a service based on their primary language that they speak. That is not as explicit as calling someone a racial ethnic slur, but unconscious bias and attitudes playing out in that example. At the institutional level, bias can look like, let's look at the implicit first, say a law enforcement department focusing only on street level drug arrests. So thinking about policies and practices that may negatively impact one group unintentionally. So thinking about which communities would be disproportionately impacted if that was the focus. Again, these are hypothetical. Was the focus of a particular, law enforcement department. On the explicit level, these are policies which explicitly discriminate a group. We've seen the studies that have looked at hiring and quote unquote names that people associate with specific racial and ethnic groups. So that would be a type of bias that's explicit, that's happening at the institutional level. So why is this important? So why should we think about bias, inequity, and justice? How does this tie to the historical context for racial equity in DC? Sort of why is my office even charged to look at this work? So we know that these aren't hypothetical data points. We have seen the exacerbation of racial and ethnic inequities during the pandemic. So it's important that we think about the historical context for racial equity right here in DC. And I'm not going to go over these in detail for the sake of time, but I do think it's important to highlight bringing it home to our city. I know many of you are familiar with the book Chocolate City, which really highlights sort of the tension of DC as sort of a city that has provided great opportunities for Black residents, Black businesses, a city of great economic opportunity for Black residents and other people of color, but also looking at that tension with a historical legacy of inequities. My office is in the Wilson building, and many of you may know Freedom Plaza is stated to be the site of a slave auction. So just thinking about that, and I sometimes get chills when I walk out of the Wilson building, just thinking about the city that we live in, and also that legacy of injustice and oppression. Another text that we look at to highlight the historical legacy of oppression in DC is The Color of Law. And I know we have a lot of lawyers in the virtual room today. So this book really looks at how the government intentionally upheld unjust and racist policies to maintain separation and segregation based on race and ethnicity. So a very powerful book that talks about sort of the forgotten history of how our government segregated America. And we can think about how that's tied to DC. And then the last image that I wanted to highlight, so that's obviously a map of DC, but it's also a covenant map. So we know that covenants were embedded into property deeds all over the country, but also embedded into property deeds right here in the district, which excluded the purchase and being able to purchase, buy, or occupy land for, in DC, mostly Black residents, also residents of Jewish descent. So thinking about sort of how the legacy of racial inequity has appeared right here in DC. And in our training, we talk about specific neighborhoods in DC where we've seen those covenant maps that people actually still have in their, sort of in their historical archives. So how do we address this work? So going back to our theory of change, we talked about developing a shared vocabulary throughout our brief time today. We talked about some of those key terminology with the goal of building the capacity to do this work. And we know that that government's role in addressing racial equity is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We have to partner externally as well. So I do want to acknowledge that some of that capacity requires partnerships and meaningful engagement with residents and other stakeholders. So normalizing conversations on racial equity, which we're doing today, building the capacity to do the work. And if you remember, the third part of that theory of change is operationalizing, putting the work into practice by the use of specific tools. So now we're going to transition to a particular spotlight on one of our tools, which is our racial equity impact assessment. We often shorten it to call it our RIA. So we are going to talk about what are the key components of utilizing a racial equity tool, how this can be used to examine existing policies and practices within your agencies. It can also be used, and we encourage agencies to use this tool very early on in the development of new policies and programs. But before I go into this, I do just want to pause because we're at sort of our halfway mark before we go into the more skills-based portion of our conversation. I just want to pause just to see if there are any reflections or reactions on what we shared thus far, and any connection points that you're seeing between ethics and equity. So I just want to pause there just to see if there are any reflections or any connections that folks are making. And if there are, you can feel free to put that in the chat. I feel like I've just been talking at you, so I'm just going to pause just to see if there are any reflections before we continue. Any connections folks are making between sort of our racial equity framework and what it means to promote ethical decision making or being a part of sort of the ethics community in DC government. Any thoughts? Hannah, thank you for your comment. Deborah, I really like your comment. Ethics aren't just a personal responsibility. The system, i.e. DC, has responsibility to create an ethical framework too. I really like that. And that really, I'm thinking about our sort of fish and lake exercise that we went through as well, looking at the lake versus the system. Any other thoughts? Again, I'm just pausing because I know there's a lot of content before we move on. Okay, I know it's Friday morning. All right, let's keep it going. Okay. So again, this is our tool, our racial equity tool that we use. We've been called upon by the mayor, the city administrator. Oh, sorry, Nina, if the system does not change, it's very hard for the individual to have impact. Thank you for that. So we've often been called upon by the mayor, the city administrator, to do a racial equity analysis of a particular proposal or a project or policy. So we've worked with a variety of different agencies to sort of answer a question of, will this policy or program or initiative have what impact would it have on racial equity? What impact will it have on that outcomes that are disaggregated by race and ethnicity? And how we do that is looking at a set of questions. So a racial equity tool is simply a set of questions to guide our decision making and to really center the problem and the people that are most impacted in weighing the benefits and burdens of that decision. So racial equity impact assessments are data driven, and it starts with understanding what are the expected goals and outcomes. So if we're examining the racial equity impacts of a policy or program, what are the expected goals? That's a very obvious question, but it's important to know what your goals and outcomes are, because you want to hopefully report out on that and be able to say that this policy or program, is having an intended impact. So what's the overall vision? The second is looking at the evidence. So what data are available related to a particular proposal? So say you are developing a health equity initiative that the goal is to, one of the outcomes you're looking at is maternal morbidity. So what data are available disaggregated by race and ethnicity that you have that's related to this particular proposal? And we focus a lot on disaggregated data. So I mentioned before that we're working on a racial equity dashboard with Octo, and right now we're looking at all of our data sources to see sort of how we can display the data, and also looking at potential the intersection of data. So looking at race, ethnicity, and class, or what are some other proxies that we can use for race and ethnicity. So looking at the evidence, do you have data disaggregated by race and ethnicity? So we do encourage agencies, if applicable or available or appropriate, to collect race and ethnicity data on policies and programs. So what's the expected goals and outcomes? What data are available? And then who are the relevant stakeholders that you should be asking? So if you're developing a health equity initiative that's focusing on maternal morbidity, have you engaged with that particular community or the stakeholders in that space to understand what's working well, what's not working well? So who are those relevant stakeholders or community organizations that you should engage with? And that engagement is really a key piece of an equity process, and it's really embedded in our definition of equity and racial equity specifically. And the fourth part of this framework is, to me, very critical, is weighing the benefits and burdens, and knowing that we may have good intentions for a policy, but if we haven't clearly defined our goals and outcomes, if we haven't looked at the data, particularly data that's disaggregated by race, ethnicity, if we haven't engaged stakeholders, our policies and programs may fall short. We often talk about in our work that good intentions don't really matter. You know, we may have good intentions, but myself, and I included, we also have our own biases. So this is also a process to help sort of really look at the data, and also thinking about those plants. I think we had like a tulip and a cactus. I forget the other plant when we're looking at the differences between equity and equality, understanding that just like those plants, the individuals, residents, and stakeholders that we engage with may need will need different things, so that we can have a universal goal, but we may need targeted strategies as well. So you may have this intervention with a goal of impacting maternal morbidity rates, but you should also be thinking about what are what are different kind of strategies based on what those individuals and communities need. We can't really take a universal blanket approach. So what are the possible unintended organizational barriers, benefits, and burdens? And then lastly, how are we going to be held accountable? So in our work, we often encourage residents, advocacy organizations to hold us accountable. How will programs and outcomes be evaluated? And those program outcome measures should be directly tied to the goals of that particular program. And if possible, looking at those outcomes broken down by race and ethnicity, and other variables if the data are available. So now we're going to go into, again, these are the 5 buckets. This is a high level overview. And underneath each of these on our tool, and we have our website. You haven't been to our website, I encourage you to go to our website, ore.dc.gov. And there's a tab called resources that has the full tool with more in-depth questions under each of these 5 buckets. We also have other tools as well. So you may be asking yourself, why is this tool important? So we often have to remind ourselves that while each decision analyzed using a racial equity impact tool may result in seemingly small changes, but their cumulative impact over time can result in significant changes. And Sarah, yes, I will put it in the chat. I'm going to come out of sharing in a second because I do want to save time just for reflections before we wrap at 11. So I will put the link in the chat. But I want to take a little time between now and like 10:50 to go over some other questions that are sort of underneath a few of those buckets that we talked about. So we talked about framing the vision. Critical piece may seem very intuitive, but it's important to think about what your agency or department, if you're developing a policy or program, what the outcomes will be. And also does that proposal align with the goal of advancing equity, racial equity in the district? And we talked about the second bucket is examining the evidence. What data do we have? I mean, not just thinking about quantitative data as well. Are there qualitative data that we can look at? Does your agency gather and track the data that's needed to assess the impact of that particular program? And if you're interested in this data piece, feel free to reach out to me because our team is working on a project. We're calling it our Racial Equity Data Standards Project, where we're going to be releasing guidance to agencies on how to collect and report demographic data when it's appropriate, what questions to ask, options for the actual response set if you're asking for input from stakeholders. So just be on the lookout for that if you're a data person and want to know more about that. So again, thinking about what data are available, does your agency track it? And also, are there any barriers that's preventing your agency from collecting or assessing data? We know that there are some limitations on collecting race ethnicity data. Some agencies may already be doing that and reporting up to the federal government. So we do understand that there are different legal and privacy contexts when it comes to race and ethnicity data. The fourth bucket that we saw was anticipating the benefits and the burdens. And I think this is a critical piece of ethical analysis and equity analysis, sort of who's benefiting from this policy or program and who's being burdened from it. But you need data to understand that. So it's important to think about what are the unintended benefits that this proposal could cause, how can we be more targeted in our strategies, in our communications, thinking about linguistic and cultural humility and the implementation of this policy or proposal. And then again, looking at the system, what are maybe some organizational barriers, structural barriers in the system that may hinder this proposal success? So again, these are subset of questions underneath those buckets that we walk through when we're doing a racial equity impact analysis. So with that, I want to sort of come out of the sharing of my screen to see if there are any further connections that you're making. I also will put the link in the chat. So I just want to get some thoughts around the questions that we have here. When you think about ethics, the content that you've learned from this week, and the content that we talked about today, are there aspects that you could either add to your current practices or proposals from the questions within their racial equity impact assessment? So what are ways that you could add to your current practices based on the questions that we just reviewed? And how can you put what you learned today into action? So I'm going to come out of my sharing of my screen just to see if you have any reflections on those two questions. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to put the link to the office's website. So this is the general link, but you'll see a tab at the top right where you'll find our resources. And just to make it simpler, I will just go to our specific tab in the PDF of our impact tool that we just went over. So also just for quicker access, the PDF. So Isaac, yeah, so if BEGA, the organizers for this conversation, if they don't send it, feel free to contact me directly for the slides. And I'm putting my email in the chat. So I just wanted to see if there are any connections that you all are making, or what are some ways that you can further incorporate a racial equity lens into the work that you all are doing based on the content that we just went over, or the questions that were included in our racial equity impact assessment. Any thoughts? Or any takeaways? So Camille Weathers, exposure to information such as this session, consider my biases in decision making. Oh, okay. There's another picture of a child throwing a fish on the shore into the sea. When her dad said her action would save the creatures in the sea, she responded that she saved at least one. The ripple effect. Well, that gave me chills. I need to find that image. Thank you for sharing that. I love that. Any other thoughts? Donette Cooper, I work in affordable housing. It'll be interesting to see how our programs impact across races. And Donette, I'm not familiar with your agency, but I know we've worked with DHCD, Office of Planning, and DMPED. Yes, DHCD. Okay, yeah. So we've worked with several of your colleagues. I know there's been a regional housing equity initiative, so we've engaged with some of your colleagues in DHCD. Thank you. Any other thoughts before I bring up my closing slides? Hannah, great question. Is there an estimated time frame for when the data guidance will be released? So we were about to submit it to IQ. So we worked with the Mayor's Office of Policy and Innovation and OCTO and other agency stakeholders. So we just went through sort of a stakeholder engagement process. So we're incorporating that and we'll be submitting it to IQ. So it's just dependent upon when the IQ process is complete. But if you have specific questions, I'd be happy to sort of share sort of our high level takeaways while we wait for the guidance to be finalized and published. So Nicholas says, like the equity versus equality graphic, and reminded me of the restatement of the golden rule. Oh, don't treat others as you treat yourself, how they'd want to be treated. Yes, thank you. Diane Graves, appreciate the emphasis on data. Some of the familiar statements I hear when people push back on incorporating DEI is that there's no proof that DEI policies have an impact. That's a huge critique. So that's why we stress that racial equity is data driven. And we're actually, this is just an aside, we actually are establishing partnerships with academic institutions to think through what a racial equity evaluation project will look like for DC government. But there are data out there, but yes, that's a very common critique. Nina Jones, do you see DEIB as a permanent government initiative or a passing fad, as seen in some private enterprises who have completely shifted away from it? Very fair question. I have colleagues in the private sector who are very concerned about their positions. So we have seen some of those organizations not act on the statements that they released or cut or laid off jobs. So I would say within DC government, I can't speak to other governments. We have seen rolling back of initiatives and attacks on DEI, book bans, et cetera. So I can only speak to the commitment from Mayor Bowser and the city administrator who I report to on their ongoing commitment. For example, this is our third year of partnering with the budget team and our racial equity budget tool. And we're going to be moving toward implementing our racial equity action plan once we get the approval from the mayor. And that's a 3-year plan. So we have short, medium, and long-term goals that we're committed to. So I think it's up to us to keep it at the forefront. And also thinking about, and this is going to be my last comment before I go to my concluding slides, is thinking about not just the moral imperative, but the fiscal imperative. So I mentioned health equity because that's my background, that we're paying for billions of dollars for not addressing health inequity. So there's a moral, fiscal, and business imperative to address equity. So thank you for those comments. I just want to pull up my last couple of slides before we wrap. This is another image. If you haven't guessed, I'm a lover of words, metaphors, and visuals. So this is an image. You see sort of folks on a boat, and we see two people at the top. You know, they're not concerned. They're in the same boat, but the boat has a hole in it, but they're, you know, relaxing and saying, sure glad that hole isn't on our end. But they're all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat. And that the systems that are failing communities of color are actually failing us all. So when we talk about advancing racial equity, yes, we're talking about closing and addressing equity gaps, but we're also talking about improving outcomes for all people. And that racial equity is good government, that we have to be respectful in how we engage our resident stakeholders, respectful how we engage each other within our own agencies. We have to be responsive to the challenges and needs, and we have to be responsive in a way that's culturally and linguistically appropriate. And we have to be committed to this, committed to learning, but not just learning and consciousness raising, but being commitment to actions, addressing the structural and systemic barriers that are leading to the inequities and poor outcomes for people of color. And I mentioned before that one way that we're addressing this is the development of the city's first racial equity action plan. On the website that I shared in the chat, you can also, there's an action plan tab where you can see our draft plan. Our final plan that's on the mayor's desk will hopefully be released soon. So it includes actions and commitments that DC government will take over the next 3 years to address inequities and disparities. Here are some action steps that you can take. DC government is a member of GEAR, or the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. So you could go to their website and use your DC government credentials and engage with a plethora of different resources. Continuing your own journey of self-reflection and awareness. Identifying opportunities to expand your stakeholder and community engagement, which is a key piece of an equity and racial equity process. Some of the agencies on the call have already developed what we call a racial equity narrative or vision statement. If you're interested in that, me and my team would be happy to provide technical assistance. And then also just knowing that we have other training and learning opportunities on our website and also on PeopleSoft. So with that, I am going to stop. We only have like 5 minutes left. So I just want to again, thank you for your time. I don't know if anyone has any questions, so I will just pause for a second to see if anyone has a question before we wrap. Glenn, I don't think so. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about that. I don't think our team has worked on that. But I think the tool that we went through could be a lens that we can apply to looking at some of those policies. Hannah, well, Ori host training for agencies. Yes. So it's a new, also my battery, may die because I don't have it plugged in. So yeah, so for MSS staff, it's required that you attend a racial equity training within your first 2 years of hire. But feel free to follow up with me, Hannah. We have a one-pager that describes all of our training offerings and policies. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining today, and feel free to be in touch if you have any further questions. So thank you. Have a great weekend.